באמת תודה רבה לחמי פרס על הדברים המאלפים והמעניינים ששמענו. הערב יש לנו כבוד ועונג גם לארח את דוקטור אד מלבסקי מאבות תעשיית הון הסיכון בישראל. מכיר את ההייטק עוד מימיו הראשונים. הוא עצמו מדען וחוקר, דוקטור לכימיה פיסקלית, מנכ"ל של קבוצת ענק לשעבר וניהל את קרן בירד, מייסד ויושב ראש של קרן הון הסיכון ג'מיני. האמת היא שכנראה הוא היה כל כך עסוק בעשייה מרובה ומוצלחת שכנראה לא עמד לו מספיק זמן לשפה, ואנחנו נקבל את ההרצאה של עד היום באנגלית, Reluctant Entrepreneur. בבקשה עד.
Wonderful.
And now I think you press here.
Oh, okay. Good evening. I have an announcement to make, and that is that what I'm going to talk about is not described by the title that you've been looking at for the last hour or so. So if you don't want to hear it, scream now and I'll just take off. Anyway, the land of the Mini Multinational. What do I mean by this? Israel, as you know, is unique in many respects. Luckily, we don't have a whole 3 or 4 hours to talk about it, so I'll have to talk about one specific aspect which concerns you if you're in the high-tech business or in any science-based industry business. Your customers are somewhere else. Your customers are somewhere else. This is an incredibly difficult problem. If you think about it, this is why I coined this word, the mini multinational. Here you have companies which are, so to speak, still wearing diapers, but they have to be multinationals. They have to have a physical presence and an operation in places where their markets are, and their markets are not here. So, how did this all start? Let's go back to 1977, which none of you can remember, I don't think, can you? 1 or 2 maybe. There was a thing called the Bird Foundation. It had nothing to do with this kind of bird. It was the Binational Industrial Research and Development Foundation. And it was created by some people who obviously did not understand any of the words used in the title, because they created an impossible animal which was supposed to support projects between American companies and Israeli companies, frequently separated by 10 time zones, and actually speaking a different language even when it was supposedly English. But that is the subject for another subject I could spend an hour or 2 talking about. But what it did was, the US company partner was the entity that knew who the customers were, knew how to get to the customers, knew what they would buy, were able to specify in great detail what the specifications of a product should be if you expect it to sell in America, and they knew how to get it there and support it. The Israelis, by and large, were exceptionally good. I mean, I came here as I'm an Israeli now, it says so on my passport, but not really, I wasn't born here. The Israelis were great at solving problems. Fantastic. They were not very good at choosing the right problems to solve. And that was the situation when I very reluctantly accepted the job of running this thing, which I thought was a completely implausible concept that would never fly. What was the Bird Foundation? I hate these slides, but I'm going to have to use them. The 2 countries each put $55 million into an endowment fund, and the interest on this fund was going to be spent by giving 50% support to any project between an American company and an Israeli company. Not universities, not deliberately not-for-profits, because some of them were losing money, but companies. The American company in any project received 50% of its expenses on the project, and the Israeli company received 50% of its expenses on the project. it sounded to me like a non-starter. I'd spent about 25 years in America. I'm a British originally. And I couldn't see American companies getting interested in this. But I got talked into doing this job by a gentleman I very much revere, and now in retrospect I very much thank, because I came here in 1979 for 2 years, and I'm still here.
When you touch the microphone,
Oh, okay. I'll keep my hands off it. Anyway, so to summarize, in the 30 years, the first 30 years of Bird's existence, it had actually supported 776 projects. Now, what does that mean? Each project had an American company on one side and an Israeli company on the other side. During my tenure at Bird, I supported over 330 such projects, so I had to believe that the idea worked. And how could you tell it worked? Well, these projects produced products, and these products produced revenues of over $4.5 billion. The products were actually developed under Bird programs, but many billions more of indirect sales resulting from follow-up products that were developed without Bird, drag through of your other products in your line because you had the unique product that would attract the customer's attention. So you'd have to say it was a bit of a success. There was another very important element. It was that through this, many US high-tech companies discovered Israel. Now, when I would approach the CEO of an American company of exactly a configuration that I decided would be an ideal candidate for a Bird program, it wasn't an easy sell, because one of the first questions is like raising your first fund, Kemi. People said, how did you do on your last fund? I said, whoops, this is my first fund, no last fund. These guys would say, who else is in this program? I say, well, nobody yet, but there's going to be lots. Anyway, what they came to realize is that this is a powerhouse, this country of ours is a powerhouse in producing, not identifying so much as producing incredibly useful, imaginative solutions to technical problems that can result in a great deal of economic benefit to whoever can figure out how to make money out of the thing. Now, because Bird provided the partner, the Israeli company could focus on the things it did best, which is actually developing the products. And in those days we had no internet, so you could actually weigh products. You know, they weren't bits and bytes, they were actually things you could schlep around in boxes. So what was the good news? The good news and the bad news were in a sense the same thing. The good news was that many large foreign companies, not just American, but mostly American, bought or established Israeli subsidiaries here. Quite often, a company, and the American company, would offer to buy its Israeli company once they saw how good they were at doing the things they're good at, which they're very good at. So many companies are here, and you know them, some of them, Cisco, Microsoft, Intel, of course, was long before Bird. But many of the companies, something in my guess, about 70% of the American companies that are present in Israel in one shape or form had their first introduction to Israel through the Bird Foundation. It's a rather remarkable thing. It's all historical, but some of us who are very ancient like history. What is the good news? The less good news, and this bothers me a lot, and that is that we hear this time and time again, where are the big Israeli companies? Where are the big companies? Where's our Nokia? Well, I can say, thank goodness we don't have one of those, because that's putting all your eggs in one basket, as they say. Not interested. But we should have quite a lot more billion-dollar companies. And part of the reason we don't is his fault and my fault. Companies get sold too early. I think they get sold too early. We should have, I think, been able to build many more companies. To give you an idea of this, I think it was Yossi Vardi or somebody said the other day that, yes, the exports, 40 or some plus % of Israel's exports are high-tech products, but only 7% of the workers in those industries here, 7% of the working population works in those industries. Now, if you look at the American history, after a company goes public, if it succeeds in going public and then growing, as indeed Teva is not a bad example, believe me, not a high-tech company in the sense it's pharmaceutical, but I think a science-based company. As a chemist, I resent being told that developing drugs is not high-tech. But anyway, be that as it may. 92% of the growth in number of jobs in a company occurs after it goes public. Now, if you sell out before that, you're not going to get those jobs. Now, when the VCs came along, we had a problem that the company had to be its own partner. It had to be its own partner. If it wanted to sell in America, it had to have its own operation in America. And this created many, many problems. Start with the very basic one. How do you hire a CEO, a chief executive officer, for a company which is largely in America, even though the R&D is here? Obvious, hire an American, right? Who knows Americans better than Americans? Who knows how to sell to them better than Americans? Right? Wrong. Wrong, wrong. Many of us got in deep trouble with our companies by believing what I just said, that it's obvious you need an American CEO for an American company. My partner, Yossi Seller, with whom I started Gemini back in '93, he had a golden rule. When you hire an American CEO, start with a second one, because the first one will fail. Now, how do you start with the second one? I don't know. It's not as difficult as Fermat's last theorem, but it's still a bit problematical to know how you start with the second one. But I can tell you, the second one probably won't work either. But that's another story. Why? The culture gap is huge. We seem to be talking the same language, but believe me, Americans and Brits, let alone Israelis who learn English, mean different things by the same set of words. The culture gap is enormous. The understanding of the dynamics of companies and how they work is enormous. And this gap is almost unbridgeable. Us and them. The American company and those guys over in Israel who don't know what the hell they're talking about, never do what you expect them to do, never do what you tell them to do. They don't take orders from anybody. Maybe they do in the army. I hope they do in the army. I'll give you an example of a particular company. This goes back, this was an enterprise software company that goes back about 20 years. Yeah, 20 years. They were a consulting company, had deep expertise in mainframes, and in fact they seemed to know more about IBM mainframe databases than IBM did. Because in many cases they could solve problems for companies that IBM could not solve for their own customers. They were brilliant, still around most of them, brilliant people, but this was a problem that they had different set of ambitions. They wanted to be a product company, not a service company. As a service company, you're limited to how far you can drive in Israel and so on and so forth. How do you do it? But they had very few of the skills to make that transformation. So anyway, what's the first mistake they made? And you talk about angels. You know, one definition of an angel, certainly back in those days, was somebody who invests in something they totally don't understand. You try explaining the kind of sophisticated algorithmic stuff that Precise was doing to a bunch of guys from South America. And I'm not quite sure how they made their money, but I wouldn't be surprised if it had chemistry in there somewhere. They didn't understand what they were doing. They didn't understand what it was like to be having to expect to repeat invest in a company. But they were available and they invested. So the investor group from day one in Precise, as in many other companies, was a headache. And headaches are not self-curing in our business. What was the second mistake they made? We go back to the CEO. When they had products developed, they had to try and sell them in the US because they ran out of customers here in a big hurry. So they hired an American CEO. Now, this looked like a perfect guy. A, he was a sweetheart. Lovely, lovely man. B, he'd been an investor in Precise through Advent International. We'd been to his home. He'd been to our homes. He'd come to board meetings in Israel. He'd brought his family on vacation here. He was a seasoned manager. He ran a group of 600 people at Digital Equipment Corporation. So he knew how to manage. He knew us. He knew our people. And he went, and what did he do? He started off. He became the CEO. And within about 6 months, he brought the company to the point where it was clinically dead. Clinically dead. I mean, it owed a hell of a lot more money than it had. It was dead. In any other reasonable country, and nobody's accused Israel of ever being reasonable, it would have been shut down. In fact, it would have self-extinguished it. But somehow we don't give up. How did he do it? He overspent like crazy. And if you come from Digital Equipment Corporation, you don't say, where does the payroll come from? Every month you get a check, and you never say, where's the money come from? There's one 2-word phrase that those guys never talk about, except our CFO type, who seems to have vanished. Cash flow. Cash flow. The most important phrase for any early stage company. Cash flow. Where's the cash coming from? And if more is going out all the time than is coming in, at some point, you're dead. So he hired only Americans, and he could not bridge the culture gap with the Israeli company. Almost too late, and I have to say, Yossi, I don't know how he did this, but somehow or other, we found, we came up with a theory. Okay, if American CEOs don't work, we need an Israeli CEO, but if you look around Israel, you will not find people with the experience because it was too early. But go look in America for Israelis who spent 10, 15, 20 years in America managing companies, executives in companies, they know how business is done, and we found such a guy. He worked for Cytex for about 12, 15 years, knew nothing about software, but he knew about America, and he knew how to manage, and he knew there was no culture gap. He spoke Hebrew as his first language. He had family here. He was back and forth all the time. Anyway, what happened? We went from dead, clinically dead, to an IPO in about 3 years, raised $68 million. A few months later, another $137 million. And the company was sold to Veritas as a public company for $530. Now that for Gemini was a very good deal because we made 14 times our money on this. But I'm sorry, I touched it. But notice this is a period of 8 years, and this is something we tend to forget, that if you go into a startup, and if it's not a Facebook or a Google or something, but it's a real company, you can't do that in a couple of years. You can't do it in 3 or 4 or 5. It takes 7 or 8, which means you have a lot of patience and a lot of different groups of investors and a lot of very interesting problems. Anyway, here's how the stock price, HBS, is the Harvard Business School, and they did a very detailed study on this because it was a very interesting case study of a company. Essentially, this is the land where people are alleged to have come back from the dead, and here's certainly one company that did. So they did a detailed study on this, and this is, the price per share was $2 a share for the first investment rounds. When the company was in deep trouble, there was a down round. The value of the company went down, which is never a very good thing to happen to a company if you want to bring in new investors. But anyway, some of them were persuaded to come in, and then it went public, and boink, it went from $2 to $25 once it went public in practically no time at all. What is this? What can we learn from all this? I think what I learned, and I'm a pseudo-Israeli, sorry about that. I obviously don't speak the language, at least not very well. And I wasn't born here, and I was quite ancient when I got here. But I can say we, because I have been here 30 years now. And I can tell you from my experience in England and from my experience in America, if you have any doubt about it, don't. We're great at what we do, this technology stuff. We're exceptional. But to make money out of such brilliant innovations and developments, you've got to understand the markets, and you've got to have a market strategy. Now, I've heard many words used in Israel in many, many contexts, but the word strategy is very seldom even mentioned. Strategy? Who cares about strategy? What do we do next week? What do we do next month? What do we do next quarter? Strategy. Well, I tell you, Eli Hurwitz had a strategy, and Teva has a market cap now that is greater than that of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler put together. What? Okay. So, even though, and I'll tell you something else, business plans. I'm sorry if people who are learning in the MBA courses, they teach you about writing business plans. Forget it. You don't need a business plan. And if you write it, nobody's going to read it. So what you need is a business model. How is this company actually going to function and get its products to the customers and bring in the money? The only really good kind of cash flow comes from sales. The profits you make on sales, not from getting more and more investors all the time. So we're pretty good at this. How do we do it? Chutzpah. I mean, chutzpah squared. From somebody coming from England in particular, which is pretty stiff upper lippish, this is an unbelievably chutzpah-dick place. And also, the Israelis, of course, for the sake of their very existence, are not allowed to give up. It's not an option. There are many places in the world, something doesn't work, you give up. Here we don't give up. Thank goodness. Okay, so there are problems, and I think Chemi said some of this. Israel has more companies traded on NASDAQ and other major exchanges than any other country, except America itself. We have more high-tech startups than, pardon me for defining California as a country, when you think how big it is, how many people it's got, and what its gross domestic product is, it counts as a country. It's bigger than most European countries. We're second only to California in the absolute number. This isn't per capita stuff. In the absolute number of startups, we're second only to Silicon Valley and the adjacent areas. Occasionally New England comes in second and we come in third. Depends which year you look at, but never worse than third. No European country comes close. My old homeland, England, is not too bad. I know since you didn't use any slides, you can't have said exactly what these numbers are. But this is interesting to see, over a period of 10 years, how much money has been invested in high-tech companies in the 10-year period. There was a period when the first wave of venture capital came about, which went up. The upper curve is the total investment in the company. Now, where did the rest come from? The rest came from foreign investors, foreign VCs, foreign angels or foreign institutions one sort or another. And this always fascinates me, that if you just simply plot that other thing as a ratio, you'll find that if you look at the companies in which at least one Israeli VC participated, then 60%, between 50 and 60% of the money came from abroad. And it was 40 to 50% when the numbers were going up, it was 40% when they were going down. It stayed more or less horizontal line throughout that entire 10 years. I remember when I first had my secretary draw this curve, she says, "It's very uninteresting, it's just a horizontal line." I said, "That's what's interesting about it, that the ratio has been constant." I think you mentioned this, Kemi, but this curve almost got me thrown out of France because they gave a talk to a bunch of very posh Frenchmen about venture capital. And they were saying all the wonderful things they were doing, and then I had to show them this, and I got a great glee of pointing out that if you look at the percentage of gross domestic product which various countries spend on investment, venture capital, in Israel, a clear leader, about 0.7%. America's second with about 0.35%. France is down here somewhere. They didn't like seeing that. Whoa, man, I was very, very unpopular. I didn't think I was going to get dinner. And why else would you go to France, Don't try and start a VC in Japan, by the way. So, now, there's a short quiz here. We know we have certain limitations on the number of people who've had management experience. We know that most of our business is abroad. So I'm going to ask you two questions. One, of the 25 top Israeli science-based companies, that includes high-tech companies, but it's not only high-tech companies, it's also chemical companies, pharmaceutical companies, and what have you. Of those 25, how many have Israeli CEOs? Who said that? He knows. You should have been excluded. It's funny, when I ask that question to a bunch of MBA students, I get numbers ranging from 5 to 12, but 25 out of 25, all of them. And how many have their headquarters in Israel, even though most of their business is somewhere else in the rest of the world? Want to make a guess? No, it's not all of them. It's absolutely not all of them. Yeah, you're getting in the range. 17 out of 25. Now, for example, you talk to Checkpoint, talk to Gilschweb. How do these guys manage to maintain a headquarters here and a corporate culture worldwide which is common across the entire spectrum of their subsidiaries in different countries? They meet once a month, face to face, none of this telephone jazz, video jazz, sitting in the same room with smelly armpits and talking business. Once a month, the managers of every single operation of Checkpoint meet once a month in somewhere or other, and that way they stay close, they don't verge in different business models, they don't verge in different cultural aspects, and the company can have its headquarters in Israel, which indeed it does. It just spends a lot of money on airline tickets. So this is another industry actually to which we contribute rather out of proportion is the amount. I don't know what the airlines would do without Israeli people traveling around. But anyway, so you can't summarize it, but you can say that there is enough knowledge now in his head, even in mine, that hasn't leaked out of the ears over the years. And in this audience, and in Israel generally, there's enough knowledge about how to start a company, how to build a company, how to make it successful, how to grow a company, how to expand it, how to make it like a Teva or a NICE. Remember NICE systems. I remember when there were two guys in the military business. They knew nothing about commercial. I sat 1 meter away from Benny because we were on opposite sides of the same office, walled in the same office building. They buy companies, but mostly they buy Israeli companies. Now that's good. If you're going to sell yourself as a small company, for goodness sake, try and sell yourself to a larger Israeli company so everything stays here, so that we can get the full benefit from the core technology, from the IP, and from the real essence of the company. So, thank you very much. I hope I didn't repeat too much of what Chemi said. Not much? Nothing? Okay, thank you.